Today, we're fortunate to be hosting Carl Spataro. He's the Vice President of Legal at Elastic. He's someone that I actually work closely with, and if you have any questions about his technical credentials, I'll just say that he probably knows more about Git than I do. With that, I'll let him dive into a topic that I know is near and dear to him, a field guide to open source licenses.
Great, thank you so much, Court. Can everyone hear me? Yes? First of all, I just want to say thank you to the CPAS committee in general. This has been such an incredible experience for them to pull together this conference. Just an incredible effort, and I really do want to give them credit and give them thanks for doing that. As Court said, I'm Vice President of Legal at Elastic, and we're going to cover a lot of territory today. So, hopefully we'll get through it all. If we don't, that's fine. We'll get through the important things. I started with Elastic 4 years ago, and I actually did not have much open source background at all, even though I had been practicing law for nearly 20 years at that point. And even though I had actually started my career in Menlo Park, in the heart of the Silicon Valley, working with startups, and even though I at one point had been the general counsel of what in those days was called Antivirus, an antivirus software company. So the last 4 years at Elastic have been just amazing for me to learn open source and to learn more about the community and about the variations of the licenses. And it's certainly very humbling, but also extremely exciting. So let me jump into, I'm sure most folks know who Linus Torvalds is. I often compare open source to science. That's the quote of the day. We'll talk about a few objectives here. So I'm going to get to some real basics, like what is a license and how does it work? And then we'll talk about the open source license itself, some of the common elements that apply across all licenses. We'll touch on this notion of copyleft. And I cringe when I hear people talk about viral code. So we should always refer to it as copyleft, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. We'll talk about compatibility, which is when you're combining code that's licensed under different licenses, how you get them to play together nicely. Talk about compliance, which is something that lawyers worry about when we go to market with open source code in our project. And then hopefully, if we have time, we'll talk about some open source business models, because not all of us we're born wealthy, so some of us have to make a living. And, open source is great, but we need to find a way to commercialize it. A key on this, I want to say at the very outset, when I started practicing in open source, GPL v2 actually had just been published. Everyone was terribly afraid of open source. And 20 some years later, I still see some of the legacy and ignorance, for lack of a better word, and confusion around open source. So one thing I'll say at the outset, hopefully everyone knows this, you don't really have to worry about the open source license if all you're doing is using the code for your own purposes or for internal purposes. I mean, I've taken a course in Udemy, of all places, on Python, and I never even knew that Python had its own open source license because it didn't matter to me. I was just taking the class for my own purposes. As long as you're not distributing the code, you just don't have to worry about it. And what's fascinating as a lawyer who does deals with sophisticated companies, including in some cases sophisticated software companies, is I still from time to time will get a contract that will state that we're not delivering any open source code in software that we're making available to our customers for their own internal use. So there remains a lot of ignorance around open source, and hopefully over the years, we'll be able to get by that. So what is a license? The best way to think about a license is it's like a lease on an apartment. The landlord doesn't sell the apartment. The landlord leases the apartment. And the same is true of a license. You're granting someone some rights in something that you've developed, or the licensor is granting rights in something they've developed. So it's not a sale. The licensor retains the ownership, but all licenses are conditional, and the conditions are where the rubber meets the road. And in the case of like a lease, as an example, your performance obligation when you're a tenant is to pay the rent. That's your performance obligation. But there are other conditions associated with the lease. For example, you're not supposed to, some leases may or may not allow you to have pets. Some may require that you pay the water or pay the utilities. Some will require that you can't assign the lease. And similarly, in a license, there's conditions as to how you're going to use the code that's subject to that license. And so what rights need to be licensed? And I only want to touch this because I want you to be so versed in intellectual property terminology, at least, that when you talk about these terms, these variables, if you're a developer mindset, that you're using them accurately. Because it's kind of embarrassing if you use them inaccurately. So hopefully if you walk out nothing this session, you'll first of all understand open source licenses are valuable or implicated with regard to distribution only. And then second, you'll have a really good understanding of what these terms mean when you hear them spoken. So there's 4 intellectual property rights in the United States. These are the only 4 you need to worry about. There's patents, which cover inventions. There's copyrights, which cover original expression. And without disclosing too much in advance, copyrights are what open source is all about. There's trademarks, which identify the origin or the source of a product or service. And then there are trade secrets, which recursively are secrets that have value because they are secret. So a patent is, first of all, the other thing you should know is ideas in and of themselves are not protected. So a patent is an idea that's been reduced to practice. And in the case of software, and actually, Court that actually has some patent applications in process himself, so he can also attest to this. It's transforming. It's a transformation of a system or data that's being worked on a machine, but it has to actually do something. It can't just be an idea, and it can't be an algorithm. They are patent applications are very tedious, but it must be useful, non-obvious, and novel. And it must be reduced to practice. And a patent gives the patent owner the exclusive right, and these are the key words, to make, use, and sell that invention. And patents are not automatic. You must apply for a patent, as Court again can attest. It's not an easy process. There's patent officers who review the patent and will usually go back over the course of 18 months to 2 or 3 years, back and forth as to how you narrowly or broadly identify what you're claiming to be covered by the patent. So a patent is not automatic, but patents generally are covered by open source licenses, although sometimes they're expressly granted, sometimes they aren't. But the thing that's really covered in open source licenses, the heart and soul of the open source license, and what actually gives rise to copyleft, is copyright. So copyright is original expression. So copyright is how you express an idea. So it can be a story that you tell, photographs, art, and in the case of software, it's the code. It's how the code is written. And you'll find this fascinating. I do. Not only is the source code itself copyright protected, but also the binaries are copyright protected. It's kind of fascinating because you think about zeros and ones. But the key with copyright is it attaches upon expression. In other words, once you create that expression, you own copyright whether you want to or not. And it's automatic and it's there. And copyright gives the copyright owner the exclusive right to, among other things, reproduce, copy their expression, prepare derivative works of that expression, and distribute that expression. And again, copyright is the heart and soul of an open source license. Touch briefly on trademarks. Trademarks are not licensed in open source. Trademark is a logo or a mark or a name or a brand that tells the buyer that who the source of that good or service is. And it's a proxy for. You can imagine why you'd never want to grant a trademark as part of an open source license, because if you're Elastic, for example, we want people to know that when they get code, even if it's open code, that is coming from us and not coming from someone else. Because otherwise it's going to destroy our reputation. So they are not licensed. And then finally, trade secrets, we'll just talk about them, even though they aren't really relevant to open source, because basically if you're making the code available, then it's no longer secret, so you no longer have the benefit of a trade secret. But something like the classic trade secret is the recipe for code. It's not published, it's kept secret, and because efforts are made to keep it secret and has value by being secret, there's a right to it. So the four rights are patents, copyrights, trademarks, and trade secrets. The ones that really matter for the purposes of open source licensing are copyrights. So let's talk about the open source license. I want to digress just a bit, you'll have a lot of fun with the whole notion of what open source is, because I gave a course once on the history of open source for class. And I like to say, before there was open source software, there was free software. And before there was free software, there was open source software. And by that, I mean, in the 50s, 60s, even in the early 70s to some extent, the code was specific to the machine. And so you programmed the machine. No one really thought about programming the code. And the folks that sold the machines made a lot of money by encouraging people to buy the machine. So it was in their interest to make the code available to everyone. And programming groups shared innovations in the code. And the machine makers were happy because that encouraged more sales of machines. It wasn't really until the mid-70s or early 80s, for a variety of reasons, which I won't go into now, the code became proprietary. And the backlash to that proprietary nature of the code was the Free Software Foundation, which was started in 1985, which eventually led to the further development of code in the open. But because it was unable to really commercialize under the Free Software Foundation, the Open Source Initiative was founded. And so now we have these two various trains of thought about what open source is. That's a lot for a very short period of time, but the key I want to talk through now is it's a development methodology, it's a licensing model, and it's also a fork in ideology. So as everyone here knows, I'm assuming most everyone here is a developer, you're developing the code, right? The code is made available to the community, and it's published, and that's a form of methodology. If you haven't ever read The Cathedral and the Bazaar, definitely worth reading. It's got historical significance now because it's about 20-some years old, but it was really the first time that anyone took a look at the benefits of a well-run open source project and how it could expedite and lead to fast development. So it's a development methodology. It's also a form of a licensing model. Remember I said when a software developer writes code and it makes that expression, copyright attaches the moment it's expressed. So if you want that code to be available to others for them to use, you have to do something with this copyright. Whether you wanted it or not, you've got copyright. You have to figure out what to do with it. And there's two choices. You can just contribute it to the public domain, which is fine, but you actually expressly have to do that. You have to say, I give up all my rights and copyright. Or alternatively, you can license it. And the Open Source Initiative, the OSI, and the Free Software Foundation, the FSF, have models of software licenses that you can use if you want to create a venue for your software to be available for other folks to use it. It's also a fork in ideology, and this is critical to consider, mostly from a theoretical point of view, but it also plays out in the licenses when you actually try to implement them. So the Free Software Foundation was formed by Richard Stallman in 1985. I'll digress on the story just briefly because it's kind of a fun story. He was working as a researcher at MIT, and they had a Xerox printer, I believe, that ran on a form of Unix that previously had been made open. And then with the breakup of AT&T, Unix became closed. And the printer would consistently jam. And what Stallman wanted to do wasn't to try to fix the printer jam. He didn't think he needed to do that. What he really wanted to do was he wanted to just be able to have the printer send a message to all the recipients of the shared printer that the printer was jammed so that somebody could go unjam the printer. And he found that he didn't have access to the code to make that simple change, and it infuriated him. And so he formed the Free Software Foundation. But the perspective of the Free Software Foundation is that software is a public good. And what I mean by that is that there are no such things as proprietary rights in software. You cannot withhold the code from anybody ever. And if you're going to distribute the code or modify code and further distribute it, you can't withhold those modifications from anyone. So the source code must always be available, and nobody has the power to tell anyone else what they can or cannot do with the code. That's an ideology. The Open Source Initiative is a little more commercially minded, and there's an understanding that some of us, again, weren't born rich. We have to earn a living. We want to use this open source methodology to expedite development, but we also want to figure out a way how we might make some money on the code and hopefully improve overall the development process by virtue of open source. So then what are the common elements of an open source license? And we're going to talk in about 7 minutes about the spectrum of licenses, but whether a license is like really, really copyleft or whether it's really, really permissive, there's certain things that are always applicable in an open source license. The first is you have the right to the software, both in object code and in source code. That includes the right to reproduce and use, the right to modify, and the right to distribute the code. That's in every software license, open source software license. There's also disclaimers. The software is always provided as is. There's no reps or warranties as to the functionality of it, and there's no intellectual property warranties. No one's going to give you protection against a lawsuit if somebody claims that the code infringes. And then there are minimum contributions on distribution of attribution in the notice file, including the copyright and a copy of the license. Frequently, I think almost in every case, it needs to be included. These are common to all open source licenses. And here's a great example. This is the MIT license, extremely permissive license. And remember, I talked about patents and copyrights. I just bring this up because I tried to code some of the words so you can try to tie them back to the intellectual property rights. So if you remember, patents give the inventor the right to make, use, and sell. So here you see the word use, which is patent, merge, which maybe is patent, I don't know. Sell, which is definitely patent. But then you have, under copyright, the right to copy, which is copyright, modify, and to publish. And then distribute is sort of both, right? You could argue distribution is a sale, but it's also a publication. So the MIT license, I don't think they really went into the specific language of the intellectual property rights, but it sort of covers this very broad general license. But notice it's still conditional. If you notice, the very last line says subject to the following conditions. So the licenses are always conditional. Sometimes there are tiered licenses. This is AGPL 3.0, which is, we just went from the permissive end of the spectrum to the most non-permissive and most copyleft end of the spectrum. HELPv3 is extremely non-permissive. And what it does is it breaks the license into components. So the license has first a license to run the unmodified program. And actually, remember I talked about not having to worry about open source code if you're just using it for your own internal purpose. This is a great example. Even the most copyleft license has no implication to you whatsoever if you're just running it for your internal purposes. But then there's also the ability to convey, which is their form of distribution. So that sounds in copyright. Convey the verbatim copies or to convey modified source versions. I won't jump too far ahead, but the notion there is that there are a lot of conditions, though, associated with any of those conveyances or distributions. We talked about the notice and attribution. The distributions must always contain a copyright notice and include a copy of the license. Here's an example from Apache version 2.0. And this is only fair, right? Because somebody wrote that code. It's only fair that they should be given the attribution for having written it. And it's only fair that their copyright gets propagated so that folks know that it is protected. There's also a disclaimer of reps and warranties. Again, if you're making software available for free, you're probably not that interested in having somebody sue you because the software didn't work the way you wanted it to work, or sue you because they felt like it infringed some third-party rights. And finally, we talked a little bit about patents. I won't go too far into this, but licenses tend to either have no patent representation at all, or if they have a patent license, it tends to be conditional. And I really like the way that the patent license is treated in the Apache license version 2.0. Essentially, it says, if as a licensee, I decide I want to sue some other licensee, arguing that their use of this code that I'm benefiting from infringes one of my patents, then any of the patent licenses that were granted to me under that same piece of code are automatically revoked. So it's a disincentive for folks to sue each other for patent infringement. So let's talk about copyleft or permissive versus non-permissive code. So the ideology of copyleft, and I'm sure everyone's heard this, is free as in freedom, not as in fear. And the notion here again is that software is a public good. What's clever about this, to some extent, I guess everyone probably knows, this is Richard Stallman, the founder of the Free Software Foundation. There's a cleverness to it, I suppose, which is that what Stallman has done is taken copyright, which is, again, it's a right. It applies as soon as the code is expressed. He's using his own copyright in the software that he's written, or software in the projects that he started. He's using the copyright power of that to condition further use or distribution of that same code. And the further use of distribution of that code requires that anyone who modifies that code make available under the same exact license their modifications to that code. So the idea is, I like the last line of the quote. Thus the code and the freedoms become legally inseparable. So again, for Free Software Foundation or copyleft, the notion is that software is a public good, but copyleft does not cover all software, and not all copyleft is alike. In fact, if you had done a survey about 10 years ago, probably 72 to 80% of all software would have been licensed under GPL or some variation of GPL, LGPL, MPL maybe. But actually, a survey was done recently, and about 52 or 54%, I believe now, of all software that's licensed under open source licenses is actually licensed under permissive licenses. So the preponderance of copyleft licenses is beginning to wane. I would also note that not all copyleft is the same. Copyleft varies, and the amount of copyleft varies based on the type of the license itself. I do want to make a couple of notes here. One is that if you think about the best way to put this, the notion of copyleft is that when you modify the code and you further distribute that modified code, you must distribute the modifications under the same terms under which you licensed it. So, for example, GPL version 2.0 or AGPL or LGPL. What varies is the scope of what's considered to be a modification or a derivative work. The reason why there are whole chapters on treatises devoted to GPL version 2.0 and why, actually I saw Greg Back is on this call too, why we spend 1 hour a week, every week, like going through licenses is because some of the licenses, especially the GPL version 2.0, is not that precisely written. They reference what's called a derivative work as being also covered by GPL version 2.0, but they then go on to describe something that under copyright isn't really a derivative work. It's sort of like a combined with or containing the code, which creates a lot of concern because GPL version 2.0 was written like 1993 or 94 when code was distributed by hard or by disk drives. It never contemplated the internet and certainly never contemplated GitHub. So that's where a lot of concern runs into. That's where there's a lot of concerns. So not all copyleft is the same. There are varying degrees. The strong copyleft is a Pharaoh GPL v3.0 GPL, and then weak copyleft would be something like GPL. Well, v2 is the class path exception where they allow modifications to be distributed under proprietary license. And in the middle, you have LGPL and MPL, and essentially what they do is they say you can do works that are not combined and distribute those under any license that you want. All we care about is that if you modify our source code, just our source code, that you make those modifications available under the same license. I want to contrast copyleft with a very permissive license. So the notion of a copyleft license is you're controlling the licensee's use to establish the license under which they're going to distribute modified versions of the code. A permissive license says, here's my code, you can do what you want with it, you can modify the code and you can license those modifications under any license that you want. So we're not going to control how you downstream license your modifications of the code. However, of course, we still want to make sure that you give us, that you attribute the code to us, and you make those modified versions available for viewing so that people can see what you did to the source code that we allowed you to use. So a permissive license doesn't try to impact or control downstream licenses. And that's the difference between copyleft and permissive. Copyleft tries to control the licensing terms for downstream licenses. Permissive licenses don't. And there's this interesting little chart here that I borrowed, which kind of puts a map and shows from the spectrum of very permissive to strongly protective or very copyleft. And the arrows here begin to contemplate the next topic, which is compatibility. You'll see that on the left, you can go from very permissive licenses, which don't try to control the downstream licenses, to very protected licenses, which absolutely control what downstream licenses apply. So let's talk about compatibility. And I also like to remind you, again, the asterisk here, it really only matters if you're distributing the code. Because these conditions on downstream licensing, if you're not downstream licensing, they're not relevant. So the notion of compatibility is that the least permissive license will prevail. So in this example, which is taken from a wonderful book, and actually I have a list of resources at the end of my talk, Heather Meeker has a great website, and even within her website, you can get a free copy of her book, Open Source for Business, and this chart is taken from that book. But remember we talked about if you want to use Apache 2.0 for your project, Apache 2.0 is a very permissive license, right? You're allowing your licensees to modify the code and redistribute those licenses and redistribute that modified code any way that they want. Well, if you've got GPL software in that project or in that package, it's going to be a problem because GPL doesn't permit the downstream licensees to do what they want. In fact, GPL requires you to license your target under GPL. So you would have an error or an incompatible license. Instead, what you would have, if you've got, and this is, again, the notion that the least permissive license prevails, if you have in a project multiple bundles of licenses, you have to go to the least permissive one, essentially, and that's the one that's going to apply to your subsequent licensing of the code. And if it were only that simple, there's also entire charts devoted to compatibility because of the way that GPL version 2 and GPL version 3 and then AGPL v3 evolved. It's not always quite that clear cut, but the general principle is you can only license your project under the least permissive license in the package that you've got, which of course triggers the notion of compliance because if you're a lawyer, like me, you worry about violating somebody's license rights, because if you do that, then you're violating their copyright. And in addition to having breached a contract, that person can sue you for copyright infringement. And if it's a willful infringement, there's treble damages. But even if it isn't willful infringement, they can stop. They can actually literally prevent you from further selling or even supporting that software until you fix the incompatibility. So it's something that lawyers do worry about a lot, is being compliant. But before I talk about compliance in the notion of people being mean, for lack of a better word, I do want to talk about the softer side of compliance, which is why we should comply anyway. And this gets to, I think, a happy marriage of the principles of the FSF and the OSI, which is you want to honor the code, right? You want to honor the person who wrote the code, and you want to comply with their wishes. So if they have, the desire to control downstream licenses, we should respect that. I think you also want to, preserve the copyright. But for a lot of folks, and actually one of the greatest examples of this was a commentator in a seminar I attended once who had a pacemaker. And the pacemaker that controlled her heart had software built into it. And it was closed source software. And she was saying, this is really interesting. There's this code that controls my pacemaker that basically controls my life. I'm a developer. I'd like to read that code so I could figure out what's going on there, but I can't because it's closed. So the notion of compliance is that if somebody wants their code to be available to the marketplace, we should honor that. And then many times, even some of the organizations that enforce copyright compliance or enforce license compliance, they're not out to make money. They're not out to ruin your business model. They just really strongly believe that code and modifications to the code should be made available to the public. So I do want to say that's the softer side of compliance, and I think it's important, as developers and as lawyers, to honor that. So a couple of things we look at when we're trying to deal with distribution is, provide the attribution, provide the notice, identify changes to the code if the license requires it. If it's a weak copy left, you preserve the progeny of the source code, which is to say that you make sure that any modifications that you've made are available to be viewed and are subject to the same license as the original source code. If it's a strong copy left, you have to preserve the freedom of the code, which is, again, everything gets licensed under the least permissive license. And then how do you make sure that your project has the right license, or that you didn't bring a component into your project that's going to basically conflict with the license you want to go through? So I'm just giving an example of how we do this at Elastic. People have various ways of doing it. This is the way we do it. We established an open source policy, and this was primarily driven by our engineering team, with lawyers just kind of helping out on the side. But we took a look at the various licenses that were available through the OSI in particular, and we came up with the red list, which is licenses we could never license because we wanted to license our code under Apache 2.0. So, for example, if we have a GPL or a GPL v2 project component within our code, it's going to create a problem for us because that's going to prevent us from being able to license under Apache 2.0. So we have a red list, we have a yellow list, which are licenses that we might be able to include with some caveats. And then we have a green list, which is software that you can include because the licenses are entirely compatible with Apache 2.0. So our policy talks about what licenses are compatible, and then also talks about what has to be required in each of the license files and the headers and the notices to make sure that we're honoring the attribution obligations that we have. We also have a due diligence component, which is a tool called FASA, and there are other tools out there, but it's an automated tool that scans the code and identifies the license that applies to each of the components that have been vendored or built into the project. And not only does FASA identify the license that applies to the snippet or the code that might be included within our code, it also is able to revert back to GitHub and look back like 2 or 3 generations to make sure that the person or entity from whom we obtained that code may have licensed it under one particular type of open source license, say the MIT license, but we have to make sure that they didn't actually violate a license policy with some of the components that they built into their project. So it goes back 2 or 3 generations to ensure that there's consistency of licensing throughout, which is pretty remarkable. And then in our proprietary licenses, where we take advantage of the Apache 2.0 license to license some of our code under proprietary terms, but we make sure in those licenses to call out the fact that we do have open source software in our project or in our code, and that those components are available under the terms of those open source licenses. And we also provide a location where individuals can find out what the third-party dependencies is. Oh, seven levels. That's pretty cool. And this is the last part of our compliance program, which is, we publish a list of all of the open source components that we have. And I'm guessing probably not every single license requires us to do that, but we just think that's the right thing to do. So if you go to our open source disclaimer page, you'll see a list of literally every component that is licensed in from a third party, the version, the license, and a URL where you can actually get that component. Finally, we'll talk a little bit about open source business models. There are various ways of making money in open source because sure, the code might be freely available, right? We might make the code available for free, and we may make a license to that code available for free, but that doesn't mean we aren't going to make any money on it. And the greatest example I can come up with is my own company, Elastic. It was an open source project that was started by our now CEO when he was an engineer in 2009, I believe. He wrote the Elasticsearch software and made it available under Apache 2.0, which is a very permissive license, right? So he wasn't trying to control downstream licensees. And there was no model for making money at that point. But ultimately, he was able to eventually turn that into a business, a very powerful business. We're on target to do about between $550 and $570 million a year. I think that's what our latest earnings announcement stated. And we have a market cap of around $10 billion. So obviously, you can be successful in open source. And in fact, there are venture capitalists now in the Silicon Valley who focus they do focus exclusively on open source based companies because the development methodology is so powerful and because the communities that develop around open source projects are so tight. So there are ways to make money at it. One of the ways is to dual license. I don't think this is a viable license and a viable model in the long term, but it certainly has been a viable license. Oracle has used it. Essentially, you have separate code bases. You have an open source code base, which is available for free, and then you have additional features and functions that aren't included in the original distribution. Sometimes it's even an entirely separate code base, which are not available. So I'm not going to dwell too much on that. The more evolving business model that I see, I think most of us see, is the notion of value add on top of the open source. And this works really well when you've got like a platform. So Elastic is a great example. Red Hat actually is a wonderful example. They license a version of Linux under even GPL-v2, but they still are able to make money because they add support on top of the code. Because when you go to production, as most of you may know, having actually doing this for a living, when you go to production, the last thing you want to do is not have a supported version of your software. So a lot of times folks will take an open source project, get it through the lab, and decide to go into production with it. And that's the point at which they'll reach out to Elastic and say, support this because I really want to have this project supported. And then in addition, you can build additional features and functions on top of the platform that and you charge for those, but that's a representation of the fact that you've created significant value above and beyond the platform itself. I do want to talk a little bit about the difference between open core and open source. And at the end of this presentation, in the slide, in the resources slide, you'll see a link to an open core seminar that's going on later this month that is free, and I would love to attend. I encourage other folks to attend. But the difference between open core and open source is that, remember I talked at the very beginning about like what is open source? Like open source is a form of development. So open source is a form of development. You can actually have an open core development, which is that the code is made available to the public, and the community is invited to participate in development of the code. It's just that open source licenses won't apply to the entirety of the project. So open source will apply to some of the project, but not necessarily to all of it. And so an open core model is intended to try to preserve some value to the project manager associated with the value add features and functions. It really evolved. I don't think I have it. I'll jump forward. It really evolved largely out of the fact that companies like Amazon are able to offer a software as a service version of permissively licensed open source without contributing back to the community, and so they can leverage essentially their monopoly or large market power as a provider of a SaaS platform to offer the open source code as a service and make a lot of money on it, but not contribute anything back to the community. And of course, what folks like Elastic, MongoDB, and Timescale do themselves is we figured we can make this available ourselves as a value-add business model to our community. So the code is still open. People can still see it and develop it. But we just make available the convenience of a SaaS platform for bringing it into production. And as solutions evolve, like ours, from open source to more fully baked solutions, our customer base changes, and our customer base might be driven by folks who really don't want to try to build the infrastructure to host the software. They just want to plug and play or turn it on, and that's what a SaaS model does. So that's another version of an open source business model that's gaining a lot of traction. I think I mentioned this, but I'll reiterate. There's a company called Timescale DB, and they changed their business model about 3 months ago. They are only monetizing through their SaaS offering now. So, they still make the open source available for self-management purposes, but they're dedicating themselves entirely to SaaS as a business model. So this is going to be a really exciting area to see over the next few years as people come up with increasingly creative ways to take, basically the power of the collaborative development and turn it into a business. So with that, I promised that there would be a list of resources. Here's the list. A few that jump out at me, but I think these slides will be available. Heather Meeker is really just a great source of knowledge. Go to her website. There's all the information you ever want there. TLDR Legal is a great source of really synopses of the various licenses that are out there. So if you have a license and you kind of want to not have to read the legalese and figure out what it means, go to TLDR. It's a great resource. And then a few others are there. LinuxFoundation.org is a great resource also. And then finally, the Open Core Summit I mentioned is at the bottom of the resource list there. I think it's going to be an interesting and fun seminar. And so with that, I will take any questions or comments.
Go ahead, Eli.
Howdy. Thanks for the talk, Carl. It's very educational. I feel like it connected a lot of dots for me because I've heard the ideology of, say, free software, but the practical emphasis from open source and how they kind of interact. So that just light bulbs. One thing I was curious about is if you could speak a little bit more on compliance. I guess, I am a software developer. I work for a small company. I used FOSS-A because I thought, well, this is clearly beneficial because we are selling software as proprietary, but we use open source software, so we should be due diligent. But part of me still wonders, do you know of any examples of prosecution of violation of license terms? So I guess in a case where somebody has that kind of invalid chain and somehow it's prosecuted, I guess I'm kind of lost there because I also wonder, how would they know too? And I guess that kind of gets into intent. But yeah, if you could maybe just speak a little on that.
Sure, I'll do my best. Two or three things come to mind. One is actually this is like anecdotal. One of our customers is a German. I won't give their name away, but it's a German company. And we actually, one of the things that triggered our whole open source compliance program was in Europe in particular, there were some GPL trolls, for lack of a better word. They were open source trolls. And I can't remember the exact project, but essentially there were trolls who were making their code available under GPL v2 and then looking to see distributions where they could tell that someone had brought their code in. I'm not sure exactly how they could tell because they didn't have access to the source necessarily, or if it's licensed under Apache 2.0, they absolutely would have access to the source. And then they would go out and basically, hold up proprietary or, Apache 2.0 license projects for the sake of extracting a toll. Those seem to be not as prevalent as they were maybe about 5 years ago. But this German customer was really concerned about that, and they were actually. We had a really good discussion with them, and their concern actually prompted us to kind of accelerate our publication of components so that they could have greater confidence that we were not including anything in our code that would create a problem. I think that most of the folks on this call are probably familiar with, I think it's now Google versus Oracle because it's gone to the Supreme Court, but that's truly an example where Oracle essentially sued Google claiming that Google violated the terms of their license when they created Android. And the basis of that claim is that that Google relicensed Android. I can't remember the license now, but essentially that Google had copied the APIs, and therefore anything that derived from those APIs had to be licensed under GPL v2, and therefore the entirety of Android was mislicensed, and they're seeking billions of dollars of damages. So that's probably a pretty relevant example. But actually, I know also at my previous company, not Elastic, but in my previous company, our developers we basically, Oracle, I won't say mean things about Oracle, but Oracle basically came after us because they regularly would just go to anyone who had licensed the community version of MySQL, and they would demand an accounting to determine with specificity that you weren't using an enterprise version of Oracle, because it was made available at the same repo, right? So and frequently, developers, either in early stage companies, they aren't necessarily as careful as they probably could be or should be, or they just figure well, I'll fix it, down the road. And so we had to actually negotiate with Oracle to get a license to their enterprise version, because it turns out we were actually using the enterprise version. So it does happen.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, the Google v. Oracle case is fascinating. It's been going on forever, and it actually went to the Supreme Court. We're still waiting for the Supreme Court to issue a ruling on that. But the issue there isn't necessarily the open source component; it's whether APIs themselves are subject to copyright. But nevertheless, the entirety of the case is quite interesting. And, I think you could probably teach but you could probably teach like a 4 or 6 week session in law school.
I'd be curious about the financial aspects of that too, like how lawsuits been going, how much they're spending, how much they hope to eat. But so
yeah, billions and billions of dollars is what I think the jury is. I think they're looking at billions and millions of dollars in damages for copyright infringement.
That's one of the debate there, or the litigation is around whether that's intellectual property. So that was infringed upon.
Yes, yeah. That going back to the notion of copyright. So copyright protects original expression, but if something is required if something is an instruction versus an expression, it's not copyrightable. And so an example would be, it's really hard to come up with a great example, but an example would be like how to turn a screw in a screwdriver. If I was describing that, there's probably not much original expression associated with that, because there might be only one way to do it. Now, of course, somebody may have, recipes is a great example. It's one where, there you go. So Aaron's got another example. They're just instructions on how to do something. And so the notion of an API is it tells you how, right, how to interact with this program. How can that possibly be copyrightable? But the notion is that there might be some unique expression associated with it. And the case history there is that the first trial court held they weren't copyrightable, and the appellate court held that they were copyrightable, and so then it's in court.
Interesting. So there's also that, I guess, traversal of the authorities, like who's interpreting and sensing. Yeah, I guess to kind of comment on too, everyone's examples, recipes. So recipes are not copyrightable. My sugar drink, I could not make a copyright for, yet Coke is, because it's a unique expression. So
actually, Coke is a trade secret. If Coke were to describe how to make Coke, they would lose all the.
I see. So it's again, it's a form of intellectual property, but I'm wrong in thinking it's an expression because it's the secret because it's secret.
Correct. It has value because it's secret, right? Right. Which as a developer, I probably should give that more. This being open source, I didn't go into that, but that's actually if you have proprietary code, right, and you don't make the code available, and somebody reverse engineers that code, and you specifically say in the contract you're not authorized to decompile or reverse engineer the code, you have a trade secret claim against them because you made efforts to keep that code secret, and they violated it. So certainly in the case of proprietary software, trade secrets do apply.
Well, this is Carl. Thank you very much. We're out of time here, so I apologize if folks had more questions. Very interesting insight into licensing, a topic that I don't think we've ever dealt with before at CPOSC. So thank you.